Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at different tape emulators. What is a tape emulator? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a device that is designed to act like tape that is not an actual tape machine. Tape machines are expensive, they are hard to transport, and once you've got it, you can't really easily calibrate it in different ways. It requires a bunch of setup. But if you happen to have a plugin or a hardware unit that does what tape does without actually being a tape machine, well, you can get a lot of the fun effects. What are some of those effects? Well, some really interesting saturations, some changes in tone curve, some tape compression, and different combinations of these can exhibit very different characteristics and can be used in very different ways. So this is going to kind of be a shootout comparison, but not exactly. I'm not really interested in which emulator is particularly better than the other. I don't think that's a very useful way of analyzing something. What I'm really more interested in is the characteristics of each individual device, and the ones that I've picked are ones that I happen to be fond of. So first up, we have the Make Believe Studio Mixhead, which is an emulation of a digital emulation of a tape machine, which I think is really fun because that's getting very meta, but they're kind of the new kid on the block, and I listened to what they're doing, and I'm really interested in it. It immediately struck me as something very unique and had a cool character. Next, we have the Universal Audio Digital Studer A800, which is kind of like the household name of tape emulators. It's been used famously on the mix bus by really fantastic engineers like Bob Horn, Ryan West, Jason Joshua. It's kind of like the standard of this is a great tape emulator plugin. And then next we have one of my personal favorites, which is the Overloud Gem Tapedesk. I don't know particularly what it's emulating, but it does sound darn good. And then lastly, we have our only hardware unit on the list, and that is the Handsome Audio Zulu 500, which is a 500 series unit that is based off of the original desktop series and does all sorts of fun, cool stuff. You can get a lot of really, really interesting character from it. So let's jump in here. Let's listen to a mix that I finished up recently, and I'm going to kind of explain why tape emulation, it might be something we want to use at all. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás, aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, de tanto que la hacíamos, qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás, aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, de tanto que la hacíamos. So it's a really cool record. The artist name is Low G. The song is called Besame. I don't know when it's coming out. It's one that I literally just finished the mix. I know you guys oftentimes are asking, hey, is this record out? A lot of times I'm showing records that aren't quite out because they're the most recent things that I'm doing and the things that kind of give me inspiration. So not out yet, but definitely check out Low G, the artist. Now, in terms of this mix, I feel like everything is pretty well balanced. There's nothing really wrong with the mix, but it just feels a little flat. It's lacking a little je ne sais quoi, right? And maybe it could be a little bit wider too, if I'm being like really technical, but really aside from that, the mix is fine. It just needs a little more. So this is where I feel like tape emulation can be really useful because you can bring so much color and liveliness to a sound that just kind of wakes it up and adds some spark without having to rely on doing things like pushing mid-range or pushing top end, which can bring things to life, but also can have the backfiring effect of making things a little harsh or edgy. And I think that tape is a really cool way of bringing that same sort of spark to things without necessarily brute force pushing top end or mids. So I want to compare these things two ways. I'm going to do first this kind of hi-fi approach. How would I use it in a more pragmatic sense of sweetening a mix? That's going to be goal number one. After we go through that, I'm going to do a second set of comparisons where we use tape for completely the opposite reason. And this is the fun of tape emulation. Sometimes you can use it to sweeten something and make something a little bit more alive and bring it together, bring a nice color to it. But you can also do the opposite and destroy something with it. And something that performs well as a hi-fi device might not necessarily perform well as a lo-fi device, so it will be interesting to compare these both ways. So with all of that introduction being done, let's jump in and let's start with the Metric Halo here, or not Metric Halo. Metric Halo partnered on this with Make Believe Studios, but let's work on the Mixhead here. So I'm just going to bring it in and out of bypass just so we can figure out where I've set it, and then I'll discuss why. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. rico es recordar esos momentos que vivimos, que el destino.
So let's do it again, but this time I'm going to talk about what I'm hearing. So as soon as I bring it in, a few things are going to happen. First, where the top of the treble starts to meet the super treble range, like around maybe 7K, 8K, I feel like there's a sort of forwardness that shows up. There's a general saturation that, I'm going to use the word grainy, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I kind of mean it in the way of, like, if you've ever watched film or worked on film, a little bit of film grain being baked into the image can actually make the whole image a lot more alive and exciting and interesting, and actually make it easier to see all of the images in a really weird and counterintuitive way. But it's kind of like adding a little bit of that 16mm film grain in a really good way, in a fun way. It's sort of like a dusky sound across everything, and of course it's also highlighting things through this saturation. So let me play it again without.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la.
Now with.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos.
Everything feels very highlighted. It feels a little bit bigger sounding. The little pluck synths that are holding down those offbeat eighth notes, they become a little bit more highlighted, so I get a little bit more groove. What's going on under the hood here is I've got a little bit of drive pushed in. I'm mostly getting the drive from the input gain. I'm using the 15 inches per second tape speed, which rolls off a little high, and then I'm pushing a little bit of high back in ever so slightly using their hi-fi adjust, and then I'm adjusting the output in order to compensate. Now, the level apparent loudness is a little bit bigger here. That is because there's also some very gentle clipping that is happening that is keeping the actual amplitude kind of the same, but it's allowing the perceived amplitude to become a little bit louder. And that's something that we're going to notice generally across the board. So one more time, but definitely pay attention to that sort of like sweetening grain quality, because that's very unique to this sound and could be very, very useful in very specific situations where you want exactly that. Like if you were trying to make something feel a little film noirish, or, you know, putting a little bit of hair onto a source like bass.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás.
Okay, next let's check out the Studer A800. This, of course, is a classic one, and what we're going to notice here is that very specifically there's a tone shift where the bass is going to become accentuated in a really, really nice way.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos.
So this is acting a little bit more predictably like what we would expect from tape, with a little bit more shift to the bass than maybe what we would oftentimes get depending on the exact formula of tape and the tape deck and all of those that vast array of moving parts that can change things. But we're noticing a little bit of top end roll off. We're noticing a big bass bump. The reason why I selected Tape 900 was because not only did it give me that really cool bass bump, but it also sweetened the mids up a little bit. It can be easy to miss that because the most obvious fact is that bass bump, but I'll switch it over to a couple of the different other formulas and you'll notice some interesting tone shift occur.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico.
So when I go to 456 here, it's giving me a slightly deeper bass tone and a little bit more of that, and it's also giving me that a very interesting kind of saturation in the upper mid that allow the upper mids to kind of stay present even while the bass is being exaggerated. But that said, it's a little bit more saturated than what I would go for. It's more like pushing things forward rather than making things glow. And I like the 900 better here for this because that to me sounds a little glowier. Let's try 250.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas, tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
This is is a really interesting one to me because it has this sort of broadband lo-fiing effect, but it doesn't actually change the balances that much. Like if I take this off.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
I get a little bit more bass, a little bit less highs, but the mids kind of stay in the same place, although they get a really interesting saturation. And let's try GP9.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas.
I get a lot of heavy bass from this. There's a kind of like low mid saturation too that's really nice. If I had a particularly thin source, this would be a really, really great selection. But I think of these, I prefer the 900. Now, what I will say is because this is acting a little bit more predictably like tape actually should act, then, and we're going to see this is true in comparison to the others, not just the Mixhead, I think that this needs to be used in conjunction with EQ. There's nothing wrong with that, actually. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Zulu, because it brings me to one of my favorite techniques. But a little bit of compensating EQ to make up for what the tape is doing is going to get the best of both worlds, where we can push a little bit less lows into the overall mix, and then we can maybe, like, sculpt the mids a little bit, but then we also get that really fun, healthy, smooth, glowy saturation that this is doing really well. So, not surprising why it's been on so many hit records. Okay, let's pull up the Overloud here. This is a really, really good one as like an in-the-box, just like hi-fiing machine. It's one that I probably use most frequently, but I'll show you why.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
This particular setup is one that I use pretty commonly. It's not just tape saturation, it's also using various other incremental saturations. So there's lots of low-level saturations being piled on top of each other, resaturating the saturations, and it's giving this very, very thick sound. I'm using the 30 inches per second. I'm using the overbias to allow for more top end to breathe. If I switch this over to normal, it would roll off top end, which then I would want to use in conjunction with an EQ in order to compensate. But the overbiasing works really nicely. And then I push into it. And I like to push into it because I like the compression that this does very specifically. It can make things sound very, very big without too much fuss, which I think is unique to this. It doesn't just, it sweetens a little bit, but it also brings up those RMS levels, those compression levels. It is definitely possible to overdo it. You have to be a little careful about it, but somewhere where the needle is popping into the red is usually the best.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
So you notice if I start to overdrive it here, if I start to really push the record level in, it starts to feel a little bit broken up. It starts to feel a little congested. We definitely went too far with it that way, so you can absolutely overdo this. If I start backing it off, it'll start to breathe more. It'll start to reduce some of that coloration, and you can find a sweet spot where it's bringing just a little bit of the compression, a little bit of the coloration, and it just makes everything feel bigger, which is really nice.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
Right there sounds really, really great. It's a really cool hi-fiing effect. I think to a certain degree you can work with any of the plugins that I've shown so far and get a similar effect. I find that this one just kind of lends itself pretty easily to making things kind of puffed up and bloomed out with those higher RMS levels. Okay, so now let's move on to our hardware unit here. So I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to play it again, but it requires a couple of things to happen in order to bypass and unbypass it.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. Tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti
So I think that's beautiful. I think that is an absolutely gorgeous sound. It's subtle, but it's not subtle. It just colors everything in a great way where it smoothly highlights all of the sound. And it also does a little bit of clipping to kind of like hold the drums and dynamics down a little bit. So it's going to play along with the limiter really nicely. This, of course, is the Handsome Audio Zulu 500. I'm going to show a picture of my settings here. The clipping that happens here is really, really nice. I want to show one other way that I like to use this, which I think is really cool. And to a certain degree, this actually applies to all of the other tape emulators that I've shown so far. But basically, you can do this thing where you over darken a tape machine or over darken the tape emulator and then push high end into that to compensate it. But it's really important what the order of operation is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this live where I'm going to over darken the signal with Zulu, and then I'm going to flip on an EQ and I'm going to push high end back into Zulu, not out of Zulu, but into Zulu, and then give you the before and after.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
So obviously I've darkened this pretty significantly. If I take this out,
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas.
versus in.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas.
I also lost about another half dB of overall level. This is a passive device, so it cannot amplify. You lose level when you're doing it. I mean, there are some setups where you technically can amplify it almost, but generally speaking, you're going to lose a little bit of level, so you just put a trim plug-in on the back end to make up for that. But now, let's start pushing some top end into the overall sound.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos. Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
Okay, it's a little hack and slash, but let's just see how it sounds now before and after. So we started here.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos.
And we've ended up here.
Yo no me olvidaré de ti jamás. Aún la cama sigue prendida en llamas. De tanto que la hacíamos. Qué rico nos comíamos.
Now tell me that doesn't sound amazing. That sounds like a finished record now. We're talking about a record that's alive, it's got juice, it's got color, it's got tone, it's got good balances, it's got good groove. So why this approach? What is this weird thing where I'm pushing top end into Zulu? Well, what's going on here is that the way that the tape emulation is reacting to top end is different than the way it's reacting to mid-range and low end. That is going to be true of any good tape emulation. All of the plugins that I've mentioned will also do this in their own way. But I really love Zulu for this specific purpose because of the way it's receiving top end. It starts to round that top end proportionate to the top end that's coming in. So you can actually get a slightly brighter sound than you normally would be able to do without having Zulu. It's counterintuitive, but I'm darkening it to brighten it so that it can be brighter than it would be without getting harsh or mid-rangey or piercing. So we did the hi-fi realm, but now let's get into the fun stuff. Let's crunch something up. So I'm going to play a little bit of this dry right here. And we're going to work on the drums. I'm going to try and crunch these up, give them character, personality, raunchiness, all that good stuff. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to go through the same emulators, but I'm just going to experiment and see what I can get and kind of comment on what I feel like I'm getting from the device. And I think whether or not it ultimately is like the best for this particular record is not the most important thing. So maybe a little imagination might be good, but more just identify the characteristics and say, okay, where could this work? Where is this working? And go from there. So let's start with our make-believe mix head right here. So I'm getting a nice little bit of crunch starting to show up here. Good grain, kind of that 16mm thing I was talking about. Kind of getting into like the hard clipping realm on the kick. Yeah, let's take out some highs. Yeah, I'm liking some of the stuff that's showing up. Definitely a cool flavor. See how that sounds in the mix. I like this. It's a very practical lo-fi-ness. It doesn't feel like super lo-fi. There's like clearly some dirty, dusty, gritty stuff going on, but it's not like way over the top. Let's go way over the top though. Let's see what happens here. So let's see. Let's go back over to this. Ooh, ugly. So this is a cool little unit because we have this blend control. So my B setting here is pretty lo-fi. It's pretty nasty. My A setting is a lot cleaner. Right, especially on that kick. Let's push a little bit of the hi-fi up, or the high filter up. But we can do a blend here where I can use mostly A, but maybe just like a touch of that grisly B sound. Yeah, it's nice. I don't think it's the right color for this record on the drums necessarily, but I could see this exact same setting ending up on, say, like, the guitar, for example. So literally, I feel like I could just, you know, maybe solo this up real quick and pull this right on down, just exactly the way that it is. And there we go. Let's tame it a little bit. Yeah, it gives it just that little bit of fuzz, which can sound really good. Yeah, so this is what I mean about how something cannot work on one thing but can work really well on something else. So I think this is a really good example where I think this sounds really good on the guitars. It's not the right flavor for the drums, but there you go. Let's go back here and let's try this now with the Studer A80 or A800. So this to me here, it sounds like the Studer A800 is really designed better for hi-fi application than for lo-fi application, which makes sense because that is exactly what the Studer A800, the actual tape machine, is designed for. So maybe lo-fi is not where this shines. It really shines better in the hi-fi department, but I bet it would sound pretty good if I were to take this and say put it on like the bass. Wow, that sounds really good on the bass. Yeah, okay, I dig that. Let's see what we can get out of our tape desk here. That's kind of cool. So yeah, you can hear that it's adding that compression element. So all of that reverb and the sustain of the hi-hats gets really exaggerated and creates this like really gluey, hazy kind of cool sound here. This definitely is doing something that I like for sure. Right on. All right, last up we got Zulu 500. Let's see what we can do with it. So setup's a little different here. I've got trim plugins on the front and back, just because it's a passive device. So there's no gain at Zulu, but it's just one extra step, so it's not really a big deal. Okay, so a little bit of hair on the kick there, but doesn't really change much. Now, since we don't have the visual, I'm going to talk through this a little bit more. What I'm looking for is something that gets a little bit more roll-off, a little bit more darkness going on here. So let's go. All right, that's just from changing the deck. Let's go to a darker calibration. Starting to get a little bit of roll off. I'm going to click in the bias, just one click in. Nice bit of roll off there. Now let's give it a little crunch. Let's see if we can get a little bit of like almost like a cassette tape kind of thing. So I'm going to move the headroom down a couple steps. See how that sounds. Yeah, there's something cool about that. The way the clipping is happening on the kick, it's like this weird mix of soft and hard clipping. I kind of dig that. Let's go a little further with it here. Let's see what else we can do. Let's see what happens if we push into Zulu a little less and we pull up the output. That sounds really nice. That gives me that snare back a little bit more, so it doesn't feel so receded. I really like this. If I'm doing the mix and I'm doing like my hi-fi lo-fi thing where I like to lo-fi something and then treat it to bring it back into the hi-fi realm, I would start here. But since we're experimenting, I'm just curious to see what happens if I start messing around with this enhance button. A lot of the distortion is going to go away as soon as I click that in, so I'm going to lower my gain here, and let's click it in one. Yeah, that's sort of a friendlier kind of lo-fi-ness. Still good lo-fi-ness. I'm going to take out a little bit more headroom. That's beautiful. That's the sauce, actually, I think. That sounds really, really good. All right. Feels like a good place to wrap up, so if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.